another edition of Bumps and Thumps, the talk of wrestling. I'm Brian Ferguson. My guest today is known as the voice of Minnesota wrestling and has been in broadcasting since 1985. He is also the co-host of the podcast called AWA Unleashed with Chris Tubbs. Ladies and gentlemen, my honor and privilege to introduce the great Mick Karch. Mick, thanks for getting on here. I really appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate it too, and that I was wondering who you were talking about there with that glorious introduction. Great and all that stuff. I figured Marty O'Neill had been resurrected or something. But
well, I've had your very good friend George Shire on here a few times, and he talks very highly of you. And full disclosure, we've tried to get you on here a few times, but we've had some scheduling conflicts and things like that, but that's okay. It's finally here and we're finally on. So I want to play something from you from back in the day that I think you will appreciate. And we're going to play it for you right here really quick. Here we go.
Oh, God.
Fans, this is Mick Karch. Another exciting hour of championship wrestling brought to you by West 4 Wrestling Promotions and the National Wrestling Alliance. Let's go right to ringside right now.
There he is.
Who in the heck was that guy?
I'm going to be honest with you. I do remember you in the AWA, but when I heard your name, when George was talking about you before, I was like, I know that name. And I saw your face like you are now, and I'm like, I don't remember him. So I had to go back. You had the mustache, you had the glasses, and that's what threw me. I was like, I didn't recognize you, but now that I see you, it fits the voice, But I was just, I couldn't. It took me a while, but
that was literally half of my life ago. I had that 1970s porn star mustache going, and that was in Winnipeg, Canada.
Okay.
George Shire and I were up there doing a TV for an offshoot of the NWA, West 4 Wrestling.
Okay.
With promoter Tony Condello. So, that was before everything started to really, get going for me. So that was the initial foray into the announcing business.
That's awesome. That's great. I saw that and I said, I got to play this because that'll bring back some memories for him.
How humiliating is that? Anyway.
Well, let's get started here. Let's talk about growing up. Where are you from? I know Minnesota, obviously, but I mean, talk about your childhood a little bit. I'm going to throw up a couple pictures while we're talking about it here.
Okay.
Let's kind of talk about your childhood a little bit, if you would, for us, and kind of tell us a little bit about it. There he is.
There he is. Oh, look at him. Look at that innocent kid.
Look at him.
They always say if you could talk to your younger self, what would you say? And I would say, stay away from the business. But that God, I don't know how old I was there, 7, 8 years old. I don't know. Yeah. I was born and raised in Minneapolis. Lived on the north side of Minneapolis for a long time. And then when I started high school, I moved to a suburb, St. Louis Park, and then attended the University of Minnesota. As far as the growing up years, Brian, nothing, kind of a nondescript, just your average kid, and one that unfortunately or fortunately fell in love with pro wrestling at the age of 9. So shortly after that picture was taken was the downward spiral.
I'm sure your parents were kind of like mine. Thought it was just a little phase in your life.
Exactly.
When you were a little kid, you'll grow out of it. Obviously we did not.
Yeah, my grandfather was a huge wrestling fan, and he was an old school guy that knew what he knew, but it was like pulling teeth to get him to admit anything. My parents, on the other hand, my dad would take me to wrestling shows when I was a kid, just to be nice. He really, he couldn't care less one way or another. And my mom, God rest her soul, would shake her head every time I turned wrestling on the television. So they were kind of amused by it. Yeah. But that's where it all started. I started watching wrestling literally when I was 9 years old. Okay. And that was a long time ago, and haven't stopped watching since.
Yeah. My grandfather, same thing. He was a wrestling fan. He passed when I was pretty young, but I continued the tradition with my grandma. My parents, I think they finally accepted it when I was probably about 15. Because I kept going to these house shows, and they finally like, okay, and again, they thought it would pass, but obviously, if you look at the background, if you're watching this, I have not. So, okay.
I completely understand.
Yeah. So let's talk about a little bit you and your Bockwinkel fetish. There he is, the man.
Oh,
favorite photos of him back in the day. You're a big Nick. What you started the Bockwinkel Brigade. Tell us a little bit about that. Getting into that.
Well, I had run fan clubs before when I was a kid. I published some newsletters when I was a teenager, and kind of let it drop because I saw there was no money in it, which really should have been a clue for the rest of my wrestling career. But I didn't get the hint back then. In 1970, the fall of 1970, Nick came to the AWA area, and I was just enthralled with the guy. He was a different personality. He was an arrogant, cocky heel. We hadn't seen his like before. Normally the heels of the day were Mad Dog Vachon screaming and spitting and what have you, and Larry Hennig and what have you. But Nick was different. And I really, simultaneously with getting into the Bockwinkel situation, I got the fan club bug again. Mm-hmm. Before I actually talked to Nick, I approached Bobby Heenan at the Dykeman Hotel in downtown Minneapolis. I want to start a fan club, and here's Bobby Heenan. I think I'll go ask him. Yeah. Well, Bobby was none too pleased, to say the least. He was checking into the hotel or something, and here's this punk kid coming up and asking him for a fan club, and Bobby said, "Get away from me, get the hell out of here," whatever he said. So, taking that off the table, in 1971, this is kind of an interesting story. This was back in the day before you could hold up banners and signs at wrestling events, before they encouraged it. Mm-hmm. A group of us were Bockwinkel supporters, and we had a sign held up at the Minneapolis Auditorium during one of Nick's matches, and we're in the balcony. We're hanging it over the edge. We're not in anybody's way or anything. It's something to the effect of Nick is number one, Nick's our man, whatever it was. And somebody complained to the usher. So the usher came and took our sign down. And, mind you, can you imagine that? In this day and age, well, all you see is a sea of signs and posters.
Yeah.
So the next week, I go to the TV studio, and I'm kind of mustering up the courage to talk to Bockwinkel. The end of the night, he's leaving the arena, and I said, Nick, just want to tell you a little story about what happened last week at the auditorium. They tore our sign from our hands, and we were supporting you. And, Nick, of course, is, ha, ha, ha. In typical Bockwinkel fashion.
Yeah.
One thing led to another. And that very same night, I had Nick sign a permission slip to start the Bockwinkel Brigade. One of the co-signers on the permission slip, which you had to have, incidentally, if you wanted to get plugged in a fan club column in magazines. You had to have that written permission slip.
Okay.
Another guy that was on that slip was Paul Pershman, a.k.a. Playboy Buddy Rose.
Yes.
He was also a Bockwinkel fan. So, historically speaking, you had myself and you had Buddy Rose as the two guys that Nick gave permission to start the fan club. So it's a long time ago. And effectively, I ran the club until Nick left the AWA, which is in 1987.
Wow, that long. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Here's a picture of you two back in the day. Where is that taken?
See, going back to, I'm going to guess, early 1980s.
Okay.
And that would be a show at the St. Paul Auditorium, maybe late 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And Nick and I had a relationship, as you can kind of tell, was very unique. I think I became kind of an annoying son to Nick over the years. We had a wonderful relationship. You know, one minute he's shaking my hand, the next minute he's slapping me across the face, and he's putting me in a top wrist lock or what have you. But Nick was so cooperative with us, Brian, over the years. You know, when we first started at the time, if I don't have to participate in any way in this fan club, you've got my permission to go ahead and run it. Well, for the next 16 years, he wrote newsletters or columns for newsletters in the Bulletin. He would meet with us every year for wrestling Bockwinkel conventions, stayed in touch on the telephone constantly, and it was just a wonderful relationship.
That's wonderful. I'm going to tell you, honestly, when I was a kid, I could not stand that guy. He played his part so well. I thought he was the biggest cheater, crappy person. He pulled it off beautifully. And I'll admit, not until years later, I realized, you know, what kayfabe was and how really they are in real life outside of the ring, outside of the persona. When they're not around a bunch of people, they're really nice people for the most part. So, I have a lot of respect for Nick. I've heard nothing but awesome and great things about him from wrestlers in that era that wrestled him, that everything, you know, on TV, they were biggest rivals in the world, like Jim Brunzell and Greg Gagne, those guys. But outside, you know, they said he was a consummate professional and just a great mentor. So that's my take on him. And that was great. I was talking to Joyce a couple of weeks back, and she was part of that Bockwinkel brigade. She was telling me a little bit about how it took her a little while to get in there because, you know, he wasn't sure. You know, you got to build that trust.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, to build that trust. So that was interesting conversation as well. Let's talk about you getting into the business, about your announcing. How did that happen?
Well, you know, the term overnight sensation does not apply to me. It was not sensation, but it certainly wasn't overnight. Literally, Brian, I hung around for 20 years before anything popped as far as the broadcasting was concerned. I had done a lot of print media, you know, the newsletters, and I wrote articles for magazines and a local tabloid. I hand-delivered publicity for the Minneapolis promoter, Wally Carbo. I would carry it 6 blocks to the Star Tribune newspaper. Literally, I hung around for all those years. And from the time I was a kid, I wanted to get into wrestling broadcasting. That's all I wanted to do.
Yeah.
Be a wrestling announcer in my own hometown. And in the mid-1980s, I got my opportunity. There was a gentleman by the name of Ray Webby, who was a wrestling journalist here in the Twin Cities. And Ray, of course, had his contacts, one of whom was Eddie Sharkey. And they were going to be doing some television. Eddie was going to be doing some local TV. And Ray said, why don't I hook you up with Eddie? He's got this Pro Wrestling America promotion. They're doing it for cable or whatever it was. And, you know, come down to call a couple of matches. Well, I did that. And then in turn, Eddie ran a show, and it was West 4. Eddie was involved in that Winnipeg promotion. Okay. And took George and I way up north. And we did the broadcasting for the Winnipeg TV. When we got back, this is 1986. When we got back, I wanted somebody to critique our broadcast. Mm-hmm. Well, why not call Bockwinkel? You know, he's living in town here. Maybe we can have him take a look at this and see what he thinks. And George Shire had him come over to his house. And Nick and I and George are watching us call this Winnipeg stuff, which, my God, I look back on some of that, some of those matches. I don't know. I don't know how I survived, let alone put some of it over. And as a matter of fact, you know, Nick said to George and I, if you can get this shit over, you can get anything over. And so that was about as complimentary as we were going to get. And turns out a little bit later on, going into the summer of 1987, lo and behold, I get a phone call at my full-time job from Greg Gagne. And Greg says, I got to talk to Nick a little bit. And how would you like to come out to Vegas and do some ring announcing for us starting, next month or whatever? And, basically it was, how soon can I leave? Get me to the airport. I'm there. So Nick played a hand in that. And that was the beginning of the broadcasting, at least on a national level.
Right. Okay. So you did the AWA for a few years, and unfortunately it had to close its doors in 91. And then you did some other projects. Talk about, if you can, some of those experiences. What was probably your most memorable time broadcasting besides the AWA? Was there another promotion that really just kicked it for you, nailed it? You were really enjoying it and having a good time.
The promotions themselves doing TV, I did so many, not only on the independent scene, but, with Windy City Wrestling and the IWA, which was based in Florida, with Rob Russin. Of course, there was the Warriors of Wrestling, the AWF, and their highly successful round system. So, and I mean, literally dozens and dozens of promotions. Some of them I look back and I think, what was I thinking? The others are stellar, and they always treated me well. I felt that I had a great relationship and rapport, not only with the promoters, but the wrestlers. Didn't make any waves, went in there and did my job.
Yeah.
As far as what I enjoyed the most was Saturday night at ringside. And that was a 4-year run. And if I could do that all over again, my God, I wish I had a time machine. I would just like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good show. I remember watching it a few times. It was a good show. I enjoyed it. Let's talk about your travel experiences. You probably traveled with some of these guys, legends. Can you tell us a story about one that really sticks out in your mind of who you traveled with and what occurred?
Well, I can. And I don't know if I want to go here, but why not? What the heck? It's a podcast. It's a podcast. We do it on Unleashed all the time.
Okay.
So in 1970, I want to say 1972, 3, 4, something like that, taking a road trip, in which we used to do on weekends once a month. Milwaukee and Chicago and Green Bay would run back to back. So Buddy Rose is driving, and there were a couple of ladies in the car with us, and also Don Morocco. And Don is going to kill me for this. Don was a babyface at the time, very, very popular babyface. But Don also enjoyed his beer, and he really enjoyed his beer on the way back from Green Bay one night back to Minneapolis. One after another, boom, 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 to the point where every 5 miles or so, Buddy is having to pull over on the side of the road, so Don could, relieve himself, whether it was, an old horseshoe or, a spare tire that blew on the side of the road, or a horse barn. He didn't care. So we're coming back from Green Bay, and we stopped into a gas station in Eau Claire, Wisconsin.
Yep.
And I went in, and Buddy and I, Buddy, we're looking around for some snacks or what have you. And all of a sudden the proprietor says, "Hey, who's that big goof outside?" And, I'm looking, well, it's not me and it's not Buddy, because we're standing right there. And I took a look. I said, "Oh, it's Don Morocco." "Well, who's he?" I said, he's a professional wrestler." He says, "I don't care if he's a wrestler or if he's president of the United States. I don't appreciate the guy taking a leak on my gas pumps."
Oh, no.
So, I'm sure enough, I don't know if he was writing cursive or giving an autograph to the unleaded pump. But there's Mr. Morocco, and that's one of those that has stayed with me over the years. Just off the top of my head. Yeah.
That's a good one. That is a good one.
Yeah, okay.
Let's talk about your chemistry with these guys. You did a lot of interviews with a bunch of wrestlers, heels, baby faces. Chemistry is pretty important, I would think, as part of that. Just an example of one of your better interviews with somebody that really just sticks out in your mind, like that chemistry was just there. Probably almost maybe you want to laugh and you couldn't because you're on TV or whatever. You're trying to keep your composure. Was there somebody that just really stuck out to you, really, that he always or she always just was a good interview?
Well, it's interesting because the wrestlers were so diverse in their interview style and their personality. A lot of times, like if I was doing SNR, for example, and I would have somebody come into the studio, that would be the first time that I met them.
Okay.
So you have to establish, first of all, the trust factor. They have to know what you're all about, that you know what's going on in the business, that you're not going to cross any lines or what have you. So a lot of times it's just, you meet them for 5 minutes, you turn on the camera and you hope for the best. You hope that the chemistry is there. I would say over the years, aside from Nick, I thought I loved interviewing Jim Brunzell. Jim was just a gem of a guy. Baron von Raschke, of course. The Baron was a babyface by the time I interviewed him. But Larry Hennig, Kurt Hennig, Wahoo McDaniel, Ray Stevens, the Road Warriors. It was so great on so many levels. As far as the one that I enjoyed the most, probably had me doing less talking than any of them, and that was the interview with Mad Dog Vachon. And SNR did a second anniversary special back in 1990, and we were looking for old AWA stars who might want to come in and participate in the show. Well, the producers called and got a hold of Mad Dog Vachon, who was living in Omaha at the time. And I took a fly, right? I said, he's never going to come in. My God, the man, he just had a leg amputated not that long ago. There's no way the dog is going to come in, to do this interview. Well, not only did he come in, I talked to him on the phone and I said, all right, Maurice, they'll take care of your flight, what have you. And he said, no. He says, I got somebody that can drive me. And we'll drive from Omaha. So he came in on his own dime, didn't ask for trans money, didn't ask for hotel money, nothing. Wow. And even though he was a babyface at the time and he had been retired for a couple of years, he was still in Mad Dog character when we turned the camera on. And I want to tell you, Brian, I didn't have to do or say anything. I throw a question at him, like about Jerry Blackwell, for example. And of course, you go right into and dog eat dog world and all his cliches. And at one point, I had my notes on the podium in front of me, and he starts looking at the notes, and I'm thinking to myself, this is not going to be good. So I'm kind of doing a take to the camera, and the dog leans over, and he tears the notes up for the rest of the show and throws them on the floor. And I said, I didn't miss a beat. I said, well, nice going, Mad Dog. That was the contract I was supposed to sign to renew, my time here with the TV station. And if you look at that old tape, the dog does one of these because the dog was about to start laughing. And man, if you could crack Mad Dog Vachon up during an interview, the dog, I love doing interviews with him. Larry Hennig was great because he always took shots at Vern Gagne.
Yeah.
Never ending. Buddy Rose, Playboy Buddy again. I had him on SNR right in the middle of the interview. He pulls out a Hershey bar and starts chomping on the Hershey bar. I said, what are you doing? He said, well, I got to maintain my diet. I got to stay in at 217 pounds. And of course, he's got the chocolate dripping down his as he's telling me this. So there have been some characters over the years, but I've always had a rapport. Never, ever tried to cross the line with any of them. And, I always made sure. Bruiser Brody, my first major interview in Winnipeg was Bruiser Brody, and I made damn sure before we went out that I wasn't going to talk about anything he did not want to talk about. So
yes, yeah.
It's been good.
You touched on something there when you were talking between Larry Henning and Vern. What was the heat? I mean, he worked for Vern for so many years. I just am shocked when I hear that because he worked there so many years, but yet there's this bitterness. I don't know what the deal is. Can you do you know, and can you touch on it a little bit?
I know that George Shire has talked about this a lot as well. I don't quite understand. The heat was more on Larry's end than it was on Vern's end. Now, they both went to Robbinsdale High School. They were a few years apart. I don't know if it was a rivalry based on who's the greatest wrestler ever to come out of Robbinsdale. I don't know. I don't know if the beef was over payoffs. I agree with you that Vern took care of Larry for a lot of years. I mean, every once in a while, Larry would make a jaunt to some other territory, but he always came back to the state of Minnesota and the Twin Cities and the AWA tag team champion with Harley Race.
Yeah.
And then Lars Anderson, and then of course with Kurt and what have you. So I don't know if it was a money issue or whatever. I know that towards the end, Larry felt that Vern was not treating Kurt as well as he should have. But then I'm thinking to myself, well, you gave the guy the AWA Heavyweight Championship
for a year.
Yeah, exactly. What more do you want? So I think the animosity again was on Larry's end, but specifically what it was about, I don't know. But Larry never missed an opportunity to take a shot at Vern at some gathering or convention or something. So your guess is as good as mine.
Okay. Well, I think if you don't know it, then not too many people do. So, all right, a couple more questions.
Sure.
You did a lot in the 80s, 90s, 2000s. How is your family life? I mean, that's got to be hard. Even as a broadcaster, you're not a wrestler per se, but being a broadcaster, you still got to make those travel arrangements. You still got to travel, make those dates. That had to be challenging when you're raising kids. What was that like for you? If you don't mind talking about it.
No, absolutely not. I mean, I wish I had a better outcome because, the marriage, went to hell in a handbasket. As far as the business is concerned and the role that it played, it wasn't so much the travel to the outstate shows, Brian. It was the constant being busy with wrestling on a local level.
Okay.
So it was either SNR or just going down to the local shows or what have you. It took so much of my time that, I don't know how the wrestlers do it. I seriously don't know how they maintain a great family life, especially in the days when WWE wrestlers were on the road for 27 out of 30 days a month. I don't get it. Yes, it was very difficult. I will say, and this has been kind of documented, WWF actually offered me a tryout in 1988. I got a call from Jack Lanza, and he had seen some of the SNR stuff, and he says, Vince is going to be doing TV up in Duluth. Why don't you come in for a tryout? Well, I had a newborn daughter at home. She was a month old. Now I've got this quandary. Do I go up to the tryout with the possibility of getting a job with WWF and moving out east to Stamford, Connecticut? I didn't know, but I made the choice to stay at home and be, with the family, with my daughter.
Right.
And all things said and done, I would do the same thing again.
Yeah.
So, there's no comparison as to what is real and what isn't.
Right.
What's a fantasy world. So, Yeah, it was not easy. Let me say that.
Yeah. Well, I can say from what I've seen on Facebook on your personal page, you have a very good relationship with your son and daughter.
Oh boy, do I.
Yeah. I mean, they both got married last summer, if I'm correct.
Yeah, last fall, 2 weeks apart, they got married.
Yeah. So I mean, it's that's great that outcome with the children.
It turned out.
Yeah, that's great. So one more question. What are you doing now? Let's talk about your AWA Unleashed a little bit and any other projects you're working on.
Absolutely. Well, as far as the other projects are concerned, I guess if you consider getting up in the morning, having breakfast, and watching TV and going back to bed, a project, I've aced that one. I'm doing extremely well there. Still do wrestling stuff locally. I've been involved for several months now with Midwest All-Star Wrestling.
Okay.
Can't say enough good things about them. Eli and David and Brian have been fantastic. The AWA Unleashed podcast has been just fantastic. And, you being in the podcast business, you know how rewarding it is, to get the viewer feedback and the interaction and so on and so forth. And Chris Tubbs and I decided, more he than me, that the AWA was overlooked for way too long. It's been going 30 years, which is hard to believe.
Yeah.
And you got all sorts of podcasts out there, NWA and WWE and Jim Cornette and what have you. But the AWA needed to be revisited.
Yeah.
So we do that every Tuesday. A new AWA Unleashed podcast drops. We've done, several dozen at this point. Just having a really good time.
Yes, it's a great podcast, folks. And I'm going to have the link. I'm going to have the link below in the description for their podcast. It's a great show. I've watched it several times on YouTube. They always got good, guests. They have Q&As, and it's a great show. I recommend it. Subscribe to it as well. So, ladies and gentlemen, Mick Karch, thanks for coming on today, sir. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Brian, and continued success to you. You do a terrific job.
Thank you, sir. I really appreciate it. Folks, if you're watching, thank you. If you're listening, thank you. And please subscribe.